This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of August 24th, 2020. And this week we're going back to basics with a discussion of really big antennas. When I say big antennas, I should say big over-the-air antennas, because that's what we're talking about. While you can get antennas for cellular systems, for Wi-Fi, for industrial use, most people, when they're talking about an antenna, they're talking about a TV antenna. And Solid Signal sells more TV antennas from more brands than anybody else. So it makes it a good topic for the Solid Signal podcast. A long time ago, in the dawn of the television era, say the 1950s, all antennas were really big antennas. They were either rabbit ears that sat on top of the television, which were good for, 10, 15 miles, or they were really big antennas that sat on the top of the roof. There wasn't a whole lot of middle ground. And if you look through catalogs from Radio Shack, Winegard, Channel Master, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you're seeing a lot of antennas designed for that kind of mid-range where, okay, you really didn't want to put up an 11-foot antenna up on your roof. It was a pain in the neck, but here's something that maybe was 6 feet long, 7 feet long that might make you feel a little better. By the time we entered the digital era of the mid-2000s to present, you've seen a lot smaller antennas. And it's not just because the manufacturing has gotten better, although that is true. It's because the technology that makes these antennas work is a lot better. Now, there's really no substitute for a plain old huge antenna up on the roof. However, you can do pretty much everything that you can do with a very large antenna using a somewhat smaller antenna and a really clean preamp. The preamp will increase the signal to noise ratio of the signal, which is much more important than the raw signal power. Raw signal power used to be the big deal when everybody was watching analog television. But with digital, you're talking about signal to noise really being the more important thing. And simple as that, a preamp is going to help you in that regard a little bit more, a little bit differently than it would have helped you in the analog TV era. That's why when you look at today's top-selling antennas, most of them are under 5 feet long and some of them are considerably smaller and yet do really well up to that 45 to 55 mile range and sometimes even further. But the question is there really a space for the huge antenna of the past? I want to say yes, and I'll explain why. First of all, you're going to have people who want to get reception from 70, 80 or more miles away. And in a case like that, there's just no substitute for a really big antenna. You can put a lot of reflectors and deflectors and directors and anything else you want onto an antenna. You can make it fancy, you can make it electrified, but there comes a point when you just need a big antenna. Why? Because big antennas that are, a quarter dipole, half dipole, are really going to receive signals better, especially a log periodic antenna. Log periodic antennas are ones where there are multiple antenna elements and each one is tuned to a specific channel, or in case of UHF channels, a specific range of channels. So you've got a whole bunch of antennas working together as an array. And that is going to be the most sensitive kind of antenna. It's going to work the best over long distances, and it's the ones that you see, these gigantic, huge antennas that you see on roofs, like, for example, our own Extreme Signal 8200 XL. And these antennas just plain work. You can put a preamp on them, and a lot of times they'll work even better. There's just no substitute for cubic inches, as they used to say in the 60s, when it comes to really long distance. Another thing about these very large antennas is oftentimes they're made very simply because these are designs that come from the 50s, 60s, 70s, just times in the last century, and they were just designed to plain old work. They're durable, they make sense, and aside from the fact that they're going to be a little bit more dangerous if they fall off the roof, they're just dead on reliable. They're going to last forever. Now, not everybody needs an antenna that's gigantic. Not everybody needs an 11-foot antenna, but that's why we sell a whole bunch of different ones at Solid Signal. That's why we sell antennas that are small and look like UFOs and get signals from all sorts of different directions. That's why we sell paper thin antennas and antennas that look like figure eights and all sorts of weird things that antennas didn't really look like before. Because those technological tricks, the reflectors and the directors and the amplifiers and all that, they work really well up to a certain point. And they're going to mean that you have smaller antennas that will meet HOA requirements, that are going to be easier to put up, less expensive to ship, and everybody ends up being happier. I guess the moral of the story here is that no matter what antenna you need, you'll find it at solidsignal.com. It doesn't have to be the gigantic one. It can be the gigantic one too. People ask me if a gigantic antenna will work in a really kind of short range thing. And unless you're under 10 miles, yes, the gigantic antenna is going to work just fine. It's not going to overload unless you intentionally put enough amplification into it that it would overload. And that's, I hate to say it, that's kind of on you. But these big antennas are very flexible in the sense that they can work almost anywhere. You don't have to worry about overloading most of the time. It's just a little bit of a waste of space, and it's a little bit harder to put up for no real noticeable benefit. Because that's the other thing about digital signals you need to understand is once you have a signal, once the signal can be detected, it doesn't matter how strong it is. Once it can be detected, it's going to be detected. Once the signal to noise ratio is high enough and the signal strength is high enough that the signal can be detected accurately, it doesn't matter how powerful it is. It's just kind of like the idea of standing in a room talking to another person. You can talk quietly or you can talk loudly. If you talk quietly and they can hear you, well, that's all the antenna you need. If you talk loudly, they're still going to hear you, but they're not going to understand you any better just because you're talking loudly. That's not how things like that work, and that's not how antennas work either. Anyway, that's kind of it for the Solid Signal podcast for this week. If you're interested in learning more about antennas, go to the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com. You'll find about 1,500 articles about antennas. If you just search for the word antenna or go down to the lower right, find the tag cloud and click on the word antennas. Also, I want to stick in a plug for liking and subscribing to this podcast. The more you do that, the better it looks to me, for my boss, and I like that. So appreciate it, everybody who's done it already, liked and subscribed. I'm trying to send everybody over to Spotify. That seems to be the new hot kind of way of looking at podcasts these days. But seriously, we're on 7 or 8 different platforms, so whichever one works for you is the one that you should use. That's about it for me for this week. Have a great one, and I will talk to you again next week.